This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Welcome to this one-day conference on Hume's legacy. You'll notice that it was the 300th anniversary of Hume's birth last year. I can't quite remember when his birthday is, but I think we might still technically be within the 300th year.
It's 26th of April.
26th of April. I think we're okay then.
Yeah.
7 weeks, yeah.
There we go. Right, we are celebrating the 300th anniversary of Hume's birth. I'm delighted to welcome as our first speaker Stewart Sutherland. Stewart has been a great friend both of philosophy and of the University of London in his career. He's been a principal of King's College, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of London, and also has had a long and distinguished career in the philosophy of religion. So I'm very pleased to welcome Stewart to talk to us about Hume and civil society.
Thanks very much. When the conference was mooted, it was very much, this is the tercentenary year. Well, we've just trickled within underneath the barrier, and it's 300 years and it's a year less 6 weeks. 300 and, what's that make it? 320 odd days. We're within the year in question. And of course, we're all a bit worn out with conferences on Hume, because there were many last year. And you can imagine Edinburgh, where I spend part of my time, there was a lot of Hume, but to good effect. Hume was not born, didn't live his early years in Edinburgh. He was born there, but he lived in the borders, just north of Berwick, in fact, about 4 miles from where I live. And if you're interested and go try and find his house, don't. It was apparently used by, I'm told it was Canadian Air Force men during the Second World War, and when they left they had a party and blew it up. So the house, it's quite, I mean, it's Monty Python. So the house no longer exists. And there was a guy, a nice fellow, who built quite a nice, tasteful house on the spot. But there are photographs of the original house around. But I'm not especially going to talk about the biographical side, though when I discussed this with Barry, he said, well, maybe you could do something on the life of Hume, but I suspect you'll all know that. I mean, I'll mention things on the way, because I actually do think there was an integration between how he lived and the issues that he faced as part of civil society that provoked his interest in civil society and actually provoked the difficulties. He was in difficulties largely because of his abilities. He wasn't frowned on by society because of what he got wrong. He's not a Fred Goodwin. He was frowned on by society for what he did well. Basically, the capacity to raise skeptical questions. That's key to what was wrong with Hume as far as the good town councillors in Edinburgh were concerned, who denied him a chair. He's not good enough to be a professor in our university, they said. Wow. Glasgow did the same, I have to say, so there's no intercity rivalry on how bad you can be. But he was attacked because of his skepticism, but also, and I'm sure you'll appreciate this, because of his capacity to write well. His wit was very sharp, and it was quite central to the reaction people had to him that he wrote well and therefore got under the skin. Now, this is not incidental to Hume's philosophy, because, and this is an unexplored area, at least not explored enough. Hume regarded language as one of the keys to what could hold civil society together. The fine use of language. If you speak in Twitter speak, and everything has got to be 140 characters long, you're not going to be very subtle in the points you make. And this is a fundamental point for Hume. If you really are going to argue about the application of human rights, or even the definition of human rights, you can't do it in Daily Mail headlines. And the use of language, and the skilled use of language, and it may well be we're coming on to that later in the day, is at the core of what Hume has left as his legacy. And I'll try and point that out as I go through. Nicholas Phillipson has a very nice phrase in a very early book on Hume that he wrote, in which he pointed out that conversation and the capacity for conversation is not an independent virtue within civil society, it's one of the things that holds it together. Basically, if you simply grunt at each other, yeah man, all that sort of stuff, then there's not much cohesion. It seems obvious, but it's a point worth making. And if you create the conditions of communication so that the subtlety of language is lost, then you're losing the capacity for certain kinds of thought. And the kind of thought that's necessary in a very complex, as they say, global society in which we live. So I just put that point alongside Hume's great skill and capacity as a writer. I mean, you'll know the famous phrase, he wanted to be the leading man of letters in the UK and to inherit that crown from Addison. So he took writing very, very seriously indeed. But as I say, I don't want to go into detail, and if I can find my notes I won't. I don't want to go into detail about his life, other than as it illustrates what I take to be some key points. But it was Hume against civil society at points. Because I know we make a great story about the Enlightenment in Scotland, and it was a marvellous time, and superb thinkers, and discussion clubs, philosophy circles, papers that still exist. Benjamin Franklin, I was listening to Melvin Bragg yesterday, contributing papers to one of the publications. So it was international, very important. But this civil society had not just an underbelly, that was always there, because the poor in the 18th century were no better off than in other centuries. But alongside that, there was a very self-satisfied, power-seeking community who ran things, as they still do in some of the big cities up and down the country. So where did Hume start, and what made him such an enemy of society? Well, the points of skepticism, and the obvious one we all know about to start with is religion. And of course, in those days, if you were excommunicated from the Church of Scotland, I mean, it was like having your passport taken away and sent to Siberia. It was critically important what you thought about religious matters, but his reputation as a skeptic was well justified. That's what he was. It was he who wrote about religion. The Christian religion not only was at first attended with miracles, but even at this day cannot be believed by any reasonable person without one. It takes a miracle if you're going to believe. And of course there's a subtlety and irony in there that I dare say the Daily Mail would miss. But it got home to all sorts of people. Better known in the world of philosophy, I suppose, reason is, and ought only to be the slave of the passions. That's a provocative way of putting it. I mean, he's not saying, actually, you don't settle everything by rational discussion. Reason is, and ought only to be the slave of the passions. Not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger. And that's, again, a very, very dramatic way of making the point, a philosophical point, about the foundations of morality. But you can see how the headline writers of the day would seize on something like that, and in the bars and clubs around some bits of Edinburgh, not all, this would be held against him. And he didn't get a chair in Edinburgh, and he didn't get a chair in Glasgow. And as Kant pointed out of Aberdeen, my own alma mater, that silly bigoted fellow Beattie was supposed to have refuted Hume. And Kant actually refers to this in the, I think it's the introduction to the Prolegomena. But Beattie was one of these trumped up little academics, of whom we are many, who wrote this refutation, and everybody loved it, right down to the king. And he was lionised in London. And if you go to the University of Aberdeen today, I think they still have it on show, there is a portrait of Beattie. Very important, you've got your portrait done in those days. And down in the corner, there's a tiny little cowering figure, and that is David Hume. Well, history has reversed that. So the intellectual establishment in Scotland who ran things, as distinct from had ideas that still affect us, took their time to sort Hume out, because they were under the power, mostly, of local politicians. So anyway, there's Hume, skeptic about religion, skeptic about morality and the foundations of morality, a bit skeptical about theology. For example, he says, in later times, philosophy of all kinds have been more closely united with theology than they ever were observed to be with heathens. And this latter science, theology, admits no terms of composition, but bends every branch of knowledge to its own purpose, without much regard to the phenomena of nature or the unbiased sentiments of the mind. It could almost be Richard Dawkins, but it's not actually, but it could almost be there. But he has a crack at theology, and the theology faculties in those days were powers in the land. But, lest you think you get away, philosophers too. Remember this one? Generally speaking, the errors in religion are dangerous. Those in philosophy only ridiculous. And there's a subtlety there. This is the point I do want to stress. There's a subtlety there about how he pressed, but fundamental to it all is skepticism. He was probing the foundations of thought. He could even be pretty edgy, and he raised the question, for example, of incest. Now, what's wrong with incest? The animals do it. Lots of animals do it, and they seem to survive and thrive and so on. As the old song says, birds do it, bees do it, even monkeys in the trees do it. What about us? And that was his way of raising the question. He wasn't commending incest, but what he was saying is, look, if you're going to have a very strong principle in society, enshrined in law, as it is in our country, you need to have some basis from which you can defend it. You need to understand where that principle comes from. And you need to, I mean, he wasn't looking for a theory of ethics, I don't think, but he was saying that the empirical evidence round about us suggests at least there's a question. And the empirical evidence is the birds and the bees. Now, having said all that, and very sceptical he was over a whole range of topics, and those of us who did philosophy degrees, I mean, basically, this is where we started with Hume, a bit on reason and the passions, but in fact more on cause, on identity, on induction, and so on. Skepticism right at the centre of it all. This, however, left for Hume a very significant problem. And I'm not sure he ever solved it. There are hints and clues, and that's what I want to talk about for the rest of my time. The problem is, well, if none of these things work as the basis for how we make social and moral decisions, what alternative is there? And of course there were a number of alternatives being proposed at the time. But if you knock all these apparent pillars of the establishment down, you simply say, well, anarchy reigns, or whatever grabs you. He was seriously concerned with what you put in place of these, as he saw it, mistaken views of what the foundations of a civil society involving moral distinctions and moral decisions and social policy. Where would they come from? Well, of course, he was an empiricist of the highest rank, and this is why I think we don't always understand his move to history later in life. He made a lot of money, so he did quite well out of it. He wrote very well. But actually, history was the proving ground for an empiricist about what the science of man, I'll come back to that phrase in a minute, what the science of man was about. Here it was, laid out in front of you. This is what people are like, this is what societies are like, this is what kings are like, this is what nobles are like, this is what ordinary folks who have the following problems are like. And the history was for Hume a sort of proving ground of his attempt to construct what he called a science of man. And again, as you will know, I don't need to labour this point, everybody then was tremendously influenced by the success of Newton and others in science, and the science of the physical world had moved on dramatically. He saw the need to do something similar in relation to morality, social policy. So the skeptic Hume was looking for a way through. and a way of giving some account of what civil society was like, and actually the sustainability, not a word he would have used, it's a modern term, the sustainability of civil society. On the whole, the lesson from Hume's early life is, if you want a quiet life, let sleeping dogmas lie. But it wasn't in the nature of the man to do that, so he didn't. Skepticism in these matters, I believe, needs constant revival, because we have theories underlying, maybe it's Marxism, maybe it's neocons, maybe it's forms of capitalism, maybe it's forms of liberal consensus that need to be probed time and time again. Just a few remarks on each of these areas. Human religion. Well, he could have said some of my best friends are clergymen, because that was true. He wasn't somebody who simply said, religion over there, everybody's mad and they're all dangerous. But some of his closest friends, Hume, for example, were clergymen. And when there was an attempt to excommunicate him from the Church of Scotland, not that that made any difference to his daily Sunday practice, because he wasn't somebody who trotted off to church, but that was a really big statement. And his friend said, look, in terms of what you can do and what you'll be allowed to do in society, we've got to block this. And they blocked it for him. So there were clergymen who supported the kind of man Hume was. There are those, however, who want to enroll Hume today in the lists of the hardline atheists. Dawkins is one obvious one. And even in the House of Lords, would you believe, occasionally we argue about religion. They're the most bitter debates that we have, interestingly. And I sort of hinted, well, Hume was more of a skeptic than an atheist, and they're not exactly the same thing. My goodness. Very senior economist of all things from previous years told me, you haven't understood Hume, you couldn't possibly. So I showed him some passages. But it's not that Hume can be defined as either an atheist or an agnostic. I mean, read the dialogues concerning natural religion. He evades the question all the way through. It's not that he could be either an atheist or a believer or an agnostic. The essence of the matter for Hume is that it doesn't matter. The issue of whether or not you believe in the creed, or believe in the importance of the church, or believe in the existence of a supernatural entity called God, for Hume didn't matter too much. What he wanted to do, and this is what he succeeded in, I think intellectually certainly, what he succeeded in was dividing that belief from finding the sources of morality. What he wanted to push apart was religion and morality. He did not want to accept that, oh well, if we suddenly found we've proved that God exists, then we'll have to take the Old Testament or the New Testament, or listen to the clergymen of the time for moral views. We still do that a bit today. I mean, these bishops in the House of Lords. No? However, that's a related matter. But the distinction that was absolutely fundamental is there is no need or no adequate basis to go to religion for moral distinctions. And it's a mistake, I think, to try and push and say, I'm an atheist and Hume's one of us. I mean, there's a famous story I'll maybe bring out later of Hume in Paris. Yeah, he was sitting with the great philosophes of the French Enlightenment in the 1750s. And Diderot recorded that Hume took it into his head to remark to his host, and I think this was Hume being wicked again, that he didn't believe in atheists and he had never seen any. And the host was Baron Albachs, looked round the table and said, look, how many are we? We are 18. 15 of these are atheists, and the other 3 haven't made up their mind. But actually, this was someone entering into a kind of discussion that Hume didn't think was terribly relevant. But, if you want chapter and verse, there's Hume saying, I don't know what an atheist is. But he was making a more subtle point than the incoherence of the concept of God, on which I have written papers in the past. He was making a more subtle point, that the relevance of religion to the concerns of civil society are not to be taken into account. What about morality? Well, I've quoted, "It is not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger." He was attacking another pillar there, and of course there is a history of philosophy about which I suspect some of you know much more than I do here, forms of rationalism. The point he was making can be, I think, reasonably, crudely summarised in terms of Nero fiddled while Rome burned, Hitler created the gas chambers, Stalin destroyed the kulaks, but none of these could be properly understood as a failure of logic or rationality. It is not contrary to reason. That's the point he's making. That it's not Billy Bunter's, "I say, you chaps, let's be reasonable." That would have cut no ice, and not just because it was Billy Bunter, but that the source of the error, if we look for it in a syllogism, or a piece of purely inductive reasoning, or whatever, or in the kind of rationalism that's very popular on the continent for a time, that's a mistake. That's not what was wrong. He wasn't saying that actually that means Hitler and Stalin are okay, but I'll come back to that. But he's simply saying, if what you look for is the source of the moral distinction in a purely rational process, that's a mistake. So religion, rationally he rejected, but also he rejected as a source of moral and social insight. Reason, one of the other great pillars of the time, that's what he's doing there. There was another potential source of where you might draw moral distinctions from, and that's some sort of inner source or feeling of intuition. And just in brackets, we hear a lot, especially in Scotland these days, about Scots common sense philosophy. And the phrase common sense, I mean, it needs a whole unpacking of itself, but often this is taken to mean, you know, we, sensible people, know what's right and wrong. And there is some inner feeling, intuition, or whatever. That's not what the term common sense philosophy properly means, but that was often taken to be the basis for drawing moral distinctions, and more usually for uttering moral condemnations. And again, we're back to some of the tabloid press here. Hume rejected that, and his analysis of this is instructive. He did not reject the need for the capacity to recognize something that was pretty abhorrent or morally very energizing. No, that's the wrong word, but morally very appropriate. And I'll give you two examples. I don't know how many of you have recently seen the Bergman film, The Seventh Seal. Terrific film, a bit somber at places, but there's one very warm and light part where the knight on his travails sees a young couple playing with their baby, and the baby's lying on the grass under the tree chortling away. Now I defy anyone, especially their parents, having seen that, not to have kind of inner glow that you're supposed to have. There is something very admirable about that. And I think Hume based most of his moral philosophy on the assumption that we have the capacity to respond in that way. This is an empirical fact about us. On the other side, I mean, you remember last year there was this dreadful story about a young child in Beijing being knocked down and people walking past, taking no note at all of this 2-year-old lying in the gutter, I think. And again, the horror that one immediately feels, everybody, except the psychopaths, of course, but that's a different story. But everyone responds, and I think Hume took this as an empirical fact, that we have these basic responses, wherever they come from, and by and large you can find versions of them in human society, wherever you are. But this is not enough for drawing moral distinctions, because of the kind of creatures we are, we feel these more strongly if it's someone close to us, a relative, or the child next door. We feel it less strongly if it's in a far distant part of the world about which we occasionally get news and there's always trouble and there's a famine somewhere. And he simply points out that the response is naturally geared to distance and time and space. So what we need, if we're going to build anything on this response, is a way of sloughing off the constraints and innervating role of distance in either time or space. And that's what led him towards his doctrine of sympathy. This is not something that, I mean, sympathy is not just a warm glow about nice people who are suffering terrible things. Sympathy has to be worked at. And there is a structure to it, according to Hume, and indeed according to Adam Smith. But basically our initial responses are biases, are subject to biases of proximity, relationship, and all the rest. Genuinely moral responses overcome these. And that's why there is in Hume, I think, quite a lot implicit and sometimes explicit about the importance of education. And within that, the education of the emotions, which is not something we talk about very much these days. But I'll come back to that. So there are various sources, moral and social values, that he's rejecting. Religion, rationality, simply some kind of pure inner feeling. It's how you feel, man, and that sorts it out. And there were some others that he more formally criticised. For example, the contractarian theories became very famous, of course, through Rousseau's work. But also that Hume would have known in Thomas Hobbes. Because the Leviathan doesn't do away with contracts, but instead of the contract being between citizens, is between each individual citizen and the leader. And that's the subtlety and cruelty and cleverness. I mean, it's 1984 all over again. There is only one source of a legitimate relationship in society. Each of us must form that contract with the leader, and that, of course, divides. Read about Stalin in the 1930s. That divides the population, and in dividing the population, it reduces any prospect of a themed or carefully thought out response to the dictator in question. But Hume had other fish in mind, and the contract theories of the time that, as I say, eventually gave some fillip to the French Revolution, he rejected. And he rejected by asking some sceptical questions. For a start, he didn't think that there was some empirical thing called the state of nature. He thought this was a philosophical fiction. Quite useful to have. It's what you have if you don't have civil society. And you can imagine what it's like, and you sometimes horribly see bits of what it's like when total anarchy breaks out. So he regarded this state of nature used by the contract theories out of which the contract grew when we then got civil society and civilized society. He regarded this as a fiction. More or less saying, well, show me a state of nature. Is there such a thing? But more to the point, if there were such a thing, and out of that state of nature, how you explain civil society is that there was a contract at the time and promises were made and we all got together. Wow, what a relief. Two questions. When was that promise made? And how, if it was genuinely a state of nature, how was it made? There was no, in a state of nature, there is no trust between the individual participants. In a state of nature, there's not even the capacity to begin to talk to other people. So you can't simply say, well, in a state of nature, there we are, let's make a few promises about how we'll live in the future. That's what happens after war and civil war, and people try to get around the table and sort out. But it doesn't, Hume argues, from a state of nature. How was a promise or a contract of that kind possible in a state in which, by definition, there were no bonds, no trust, no conventions of speech and meaning? And so he did not accept contract theories of how you put society together. He also thought, and I think this is his Calvinistic background to which some have referred. Kemp Smith refers to the Calvinistic environment in which Hume grew up. He wasn't a Calvinist, but I think he had absorbed enough to have a pretty low view of human nature that was uneducated. And he didn't think that we would get on with each other naturally for very long. In general, he says, it may be affirmed that there is no such passion in human minds as the love of mankind. So he doesn't think that's a natural resource that we have. Independent of personal qualities of services or relation to ourselves, the love of mankind, he's saying, is almost always individual cases, and it's because of what we find attractive in the other. And that may be in a community of people, it may be in the one that you love, the one. It may be because of their ability to write plays or to act. But the love of mankind is not itself an empirical, cashable sensation or sense or inner feeling. I mean, I can give you the references to these if you want to look them up afterwards. The love of mankind, therefore, cannot be used as some sort of deus ex machina that settles the question of where civil society comes. And that's because, and this is where I think there's a bit of Calvinism in Hume, that's because basically we are pretty self-centered. Now, the theologians and moralists use that in a very negative way. Hume's just making a fairly straightforward empirical point, the point I've already referred to. Our reaction in terms of praise or blame, and there's a lot of this in Book 2 of the treatise, our reaction is conditioned by how close we are to the individuals in question. And that's relationships, it's space, it's time, and so on. So just Hume setting himself a problem here. He rejected the view that religious belief provided the basis of morality, the view that correct moral judgment was based on appeals to reason, the view that an appeal to a feeling or impression or intuition would suffice, the view that the basis of society was a prior social contract. All of them kicked out. I mean, this is radical stuff. But of course, he still had a problem. And as we occasionally want to say to John Humphreys in the morning, well, you've raised all these questions, what would you propose? It's quite difficult, because Hume did not systematically lay it all out. But I think there's enough, and in the last 10 minutes or so I'll try and spell out what I found in his writings, mostly in the treatise, but sometimes in other places, what I found that could be the basis of a construction of an account that Hume might want to give of civil society. It's, we're now moving beyond the realms of straight scholarship of Hume, and I'm trying to be constructive in terms of what's there. But I think the individual points stick in terms of what I have to say. Some points, Hume moving forward was very clear. He's an empiricist. What we need to do is create a science of man. That's foundational. He was, however, a pragmatist, and this is not much mentioned or noted. And I'll give you a classic example. In Edinburgh, in the 1750s and 60s, especially, there was a lot of interest in what was going on in the USA, or in what was the Americas then, in the colonies. And those who were with Hume supported, they said, no, they are right, no taxation without representation. The Americans there, the colonists, do not wish to be part of an empire. They want to be governed by elected assemblies and so on. We don't want a king. And the issue was republicanism. And people pushed at Hume, come on Hume, what about the Americans? And all this stuff you've written in your histories about the Tudors. Why do you spend a lot of time on them? You even seem to admire them occasionally. Why not come out and say you're a Republican and we should do the same in this country? Because of course that was the issue, and that was the worry that many had. The Americans got away with it. Well, we wouldn't have a king and queen very long in this country. Hume, wholly pragmatic. And what he said was, basically, if it ain't bust, don't fix us. Why is it not bust? Because in the 17th century, we sorted out the power of the kings and the queens. And we limited it, and we even got as far as executing one of them. But we limited that power, and they have now formal constitutional roles. But this constrains them to behave themselves, at least up to a point. And at the same time, if anyone asks, can they operate as tyrants and as unfettered dictators? No, we have dealt with it here. Therefore, republicanism is not just not necessary in this country. I mean, what's the point? Why go through all this fuss? As long as the royals behave themselves according to the structures we put in place in the 17th century, and that's okay. So you're very pragmatic about it. And as I said, I think this is an under-stressed element of Hume. What works and what will work in civil society? Well, in trying to construct this, I remind you of what I've said about language. Hume gives a health warning about language. I do not find that in English or any other tongue, the boundaries are exactly fixed between virtues and talents, vices and defects, or that precise definition can be given of the one as contradistinguished from the other. A health warning about language. Words, you know the Eliot quotation, words slip, slide and all that. Hume was warning us about this, and there's a background to that I haven't time to go into. Language is inexact. That's our starting point. That means, in thinking things through, we can't simply accept patterns, metaphors, and again in brackets, this is something you may want to discuss later. We can't use the standard analogies that Butler used to justify the existence of God or to derive moral values. And the thing between him and Butler and the rejection of analogy is really quite important. So words are not precise enough for that. So he asked, I believe, two sorts of questions, though he didn't draw this distinction. I'm drawing it, and I may be wrong. But one, if none of these pillars can support the idea of a civil society, empirical question, how did civil society evolve? And he has the odd stab at that. But actually, more important, I believe, a conceptual question. What are the conditions of the existence of civil society and the conditions of its survival? These are different questions, but Hume did tend to run them together. He was 18th century after all, and he was trying to work empirically. But I'll draw a distinction, say basically, I'm interested in the second question and what Hume has, if anything, to say about it. What are the conditions of civil society, the conditions of it being sustainable? Well, he came up with an odd assorted bunch of conditions, some of which apparently he looked at as empirical answers to the question, but I think there's a conceptual question there. More or less said, well, how do we begin to distance ourselves from the horrors of being absorbed only with oneself and making moral claims and criticisms only on the basis of what's relevant to me? He more or less says, this is my expression, well, look at the terrible twos, as they say, of young children. At the age of 2, they're monsters, absolute monsters, and they have no inhibitions and no constraints on what they regard as their rights and what they regard as appropriate for them, just mine, give. How do we get from that to civil society? With difficulty, one might say, but Hume pointed out that it's actually within the construction of what became the family, and this is controversial stuff today, within the structure of what we call the family, the first reduction of the pure self-obsession comes in, as he puts it, the mutual attraction of the sexes. That they begin to see another person as perhaps having as much value as they have. It's I think, an empirical remark, and he may be right, he may be wrong, but that's what he's suggesting. But I think more importantly, and I'll just quote, "The custom and habit operating on the tender minds of children makes sensible fashioned by them to a degree." What he's saying there is that it's actually within a family that young children move away from being the terrible twos. They have to begin to give and take, they have to begin to negotiate, they have to begin to accept the value of the other. And Hume puts this right at the core of how you begin the process of moving from total self-absorption in moral and social values and judgments. He didn't think that the idea of a convention or agreement, this is back to forms of contract theory, or a promise of some kind would do the trick. But he did think that within a small community, family, or a tribe, or whatever, the give and take begins, and people move. Now, if you're going to try and make a conceptual point about that, you would have to say, well, if human beings have naturally, we're a pretty rough bunch, if we need to move from that, what are the structures within society that will enable that to happen, well or ill? And although it sounds a bit, I suppose, Daily Telegraph, this was Hume's starting point. But notice he is rejecting some very, very broadly held theories at the time, and I've already, I mean, he's rejecting the picture of society that Huxley paints in Brave New World. He's rejecting the picture of society that Bernard Shaw paints in Back to Methuselah, where eventually human beings pop out of this huge egg, fully mature at the age of 18 or 19. And I said, no, what you haven't got there, by implication, is this learning of the capacity and the need to distance within any community. Language and currency begin to develop in this way. But again, at the time I won't go on about that. Education, he thought, was tremendously important, but he didn't think education was infallible, because he realized that education could be used to encourage habits in individuals that were potentially malign. And so education of itself was ambiguous with regard to its outcomes. But if you get the education right, then you're beginning to, and this is why I think education of the emotions is not just its explicit at points, but it's certainly implicit in all that Hume says about sympathy. So there he's talking about the importance of the development of language in a community, the importance of a sense of distancing oneself from purely selfish perspectives on the world, and he thinks all of these things are what we're like. He is also implying that getting the right education system, which is why politicians always fight so dramatically over education, getting the right education system is the way to begin to move towards civil society. But he had two other major concepts that he made controversial claims about. The first is that justice is a construct, an artificial virtue, he called it, construct of having a society. It's not that justice is lying around there waiting to be built into the way in which we behave with each other, but actually how you build society is the concept of justice that you develop. And the same the other way around. No civil society, there's no justice. The concept of justice does not exist independently of a structure within which it operates. And the same applies to property, which is the other concept he thought quite fundamental. If you get justice right and you get the rules of ownership of property right, then the chances are you will have a civil society that is sustainable into the future. But these are not off the shelf. These are not natural phenomena. Justice is an artificial virtue. He also implied that there's no such thing as property without the notion of civil society and all that goes around defining the rules according to which property can be owned. So if civil society is to continue, Hume is pointing towards certain essentials. One, he believes, if you don't have traditional families, the question would then be, well, what do you put in its place? How do you bring about, and I mean, some remarkable, the notion of a kibbutz, for example, remarkable ways in which people have put alternative proposals. And he would say that's a pragmatic and empirical question, whether they work. So you have to have something like this where the process of civilizing begins, would be his claim. You have to have an adequate concept of justice. And that deals with all levels. You can see this is contemporary. It's one of the issues today. Who owns how much? And there's the gap between those who seem to own practically all of it and those who own virtually none of it, with a few in between. Is that a concept or a way of dealing with justice, or indeed the ownership of property, that is sustainable? And that's the kind of question Hume was posing today. He's sometimes referred to as a Tory philosopher, and mostly by Tories, I have to say. But there are these points where certainly he intersects with some of the contemporary political questions of today. You've got to have an education that develops the capacity for what he called sympathy, that distances you from the fairly brute two-year-old life that most of us have or have had. And the process of developing sympathy is how the shift from that state is to be developed. And Adam Smith made a great deal of this as well. So one of the questions, and I inevitably because of the other things I do, one of the questions I ask myself and hear others asking, I mean, do we have a broken society today, and does Hume have anything to say to that? We begin to ask the questions. What are the structures within which this distancing from pure self takes place in our society? And it may be they have diminished a bit. You might agree with this, you might not. But Hume is arguing that without those structures in some form or another, society is on a downward track rather than an upward track. Unless you have a society in which language, and I really haven't had time to cover this, language can be sophisticated and subtle and can make points, can draw back. A primary school teacher told me that they had introduced philosophy to the primary school kids. And she said, you wouldn't believe it. She said, this is caricature almost, but it's reality. She realized it was working when in the playground a sort of big argument broke out. And one of the little boys said to the other little boy, I don't think you've given adequate reason for that. Now, that's the kind of subtlety and sophistication that if they get it at 11, you know, they might even retain it into adult life. I'm not saying putting philosophy in the curriculum is the answer, but it does show the place of education, not least in the development of language. And I feel quite passionately about this. I think we're actually, I wouldn't say destroying our language, but in certain parts of the population we are. We're removing the capacity to think and speak with the subtlety necessary for civil society today. Justice. I'll finish with this, and this is something I used in the House of Lords. I didn't get much of an answer, but we were discussing, there was a question on the table, and we can put supplementaries in, about whether or not big business should be subject to more moral constraints in the structures of boards and how they operate. Right? Perfectly good and fair question. And they prattled on a bit about this, and I couldn't resist it. I've been rereading the bits of Hume. What I said was, look, David Hume, in my mind the greatest philosopher to write in English in this, certainly live in this country, defined greed as the avidity to acquire property, power, human resources and money. And I paused and what the hell's he on about? I mean, the questions in the House of Lords are not usually like this. And they looked around and I said, could he possibly be right? And if he is, what are you going to do about it? Because actually, greed at every level in society is, and Hume saw it as the most destructive of all the virtues. That's how he describes it. And if you create a society in which greed is unfettered, You know, whether it's people looting, burning shops, or whether it's folks in the city wondering why we're all so fussed because they're getting another £3 million bonus. If that's the nature of society, Hume's saying, empirically, pragmatically, you're indifferent. So that's what I have to say about Hume, and try to reconstruct bits of what he wanted to say about civil society. There's some that was shot through with trying to answer empirical questions that neither he nor I certainly have the expertise to answer about what social anthropologists might tell you. But thanks very much.
Okay, questions?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Early on, you mentioned that Hume tries to set morality apart of religion, and that seems quite right. But I was wondering, does it follow from that he will grant no place to religion inside civil society or human society? I mean, after all, he seems to think that there's an important psychological element in religious belief. I mean, when he talks about monotheistic belief and belief in different gods and then monotheistic belief. So in that regard, he wouldn't say that we develop religious belief because someone else says so. And to that extent, since that belief is a natural element of man, it would be as legitimate as other cognitive elements, as other beliefs in particular, moral beliefs or apparently, or speculative beliefs.
Well, he didn't want to sack the monasteries and burn down the churches and so on. Basically, put it this way, it's a bit flip, but you'll forgive me at this stage. I mean, what happens between consenting adults in church is a matter for them. And if they want to practice religion, fine, it's okay. And well, Martin Rees, classic example, he says he practices tribal religion. One of the leading scientists of the country. And that means he actually quite enjoys going to evensong and hearing the music, and it's all lovely and all of that. And Hume said, fine, that's up to you. I don't especially want to be part of it. But don't come out of church and tell us how to live. So there was a tolerance there that certain forms of atheism would not accept. And Hume, as I say, a number of his friends were very much involved in the practice of religion. And they would try and draw moral conclusions, but he'd argue with them. So he's not outlawing, he's not trying to create a wholly secular society. Secular state's a different thing, but not trying to create a wholly secular society. He is trying to define the place of religion and box it in. That's the critical point. But just why, for him, the key question was not, do you believe in God, or is there a God? The key questions all had to do with how we live.
Paradoxically, as I'm sure Hume realizes, the concept of justice and property are, in one sense, quite part of the family structure and primitive. And when a child takes something from another child, the mother, even at 2, they're starting that process of learning what it is to be fair, which is basic to the notion of justice. They take away something that's snatched and they give it to the other child and say, that's his. And that, I would think, is really the fundamental beginning of understanding the concept of justice. The notion of fairness and justice are interrelated. It's very difficult not to interrelate them, but to understand the structure in which they are related.
I think there are two questions there about justice. One is, how do you teach it? I think that teaches is not the right word. How do you basically encapsulate it within human life? And that's mother or father saying to the child, no, come on, you've had 3 of those already. The 4th one is Johnny's, and giving whatever explanation, and it usually ends up because I say so, but that's a failure on the part of parents. But that's a question of how you begin the process of induction into the concepts in question. But that's different from what are the refinements of the concept in relation to how you define justice.
Yes.
I mean, just classic example. Is a just society one in which everybody earns exactly the same?
Yes, exactly.
Now is that fairness?
Yes.
Well, Hume would try to be pragmatic, but also, I mean, people like Amartya Sen are coming up with very interesting discussions of questions of that kind.
Yes.
So I think there are these 2 separate questions, and
Not entirely separate.
no, but they can be distinguished. Sorry,
Yeah.
you're correct. See, that's the proper use of language. They can be distinguished, but the question for us is, and it's a question at the moment about civil marriage and so on. What within a society do we regard as adequate and appropriate? I'm in favour of civil marriages, I have to say. Some of my best friends and all that sort of thing. But there is a question there about the place of children within a society and the role that education. Because counter to that, remember the famous Jesuit tag: "Give me a child to the age of 7 and I'll have the man." And so it's not that it's bound to be good. It's not bound to be good, but it's actually quite fundamental to have the capacity to educate. And standing back and saying every little flower will bloom in its own way, I think has dangers.
Yeah, so as you were saying, in denying these various bases for civil society, rationality, religion and so on, Hume left himself with an empirical problem and a normative problem. I mean, the basic empirical problem was just, well, you know, we do see some amount of civil society, so how could that possibly be given given the limitations of the sentiments? That would be the more empirically relevant skepticism. And the suggestions that he might have made as to how to surmount this problem, they seem to be more directed to the empirical problem, sort of education and, well, if we think harder about the family, we can see how these sentiments might expand. But do you think he intended to offer some comment also on how to surmount the normative problem? Like, why would we want a civil society? And I mean, that's maybe a slightly easy normative question, but there's harder questions like, you know, do we want a very inclusive civil society? Should we worry about sort of segregation in Britain and so on and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, a good question, because it prompts me to think, and that's what good questions should do. But in response, there are these 2 distinct types of question, but I did stress, look, this is a distinction I'm imposing on them. You don't find them anew. And he was an empiricist. He really was very, very committed to seeing how things were. But maybe I could put my point this way. Not any account of justice would do. Not any account of the structures of society automatically is okay as long as it imposes order, because he was also a pragmatist. So internally to these processes, he would allow the importance of the criticism and also the evolution of our understanding of the nature of justice or the nature of property. And the nature of property has changed radically in a cyber world. I mean, we're debating the question of patents and also copyright and so on. I just signed my life away on copyright here, I understand, for this. But it changes. And I mean, even for that pragmatic reason, you've got to begin to redefine what we mean by intellectual property in this case. But I think more importantly, any structure or shape that you give, say, to the concept of justice within a society, and you enshrine it in incredibly complex laws, is open in principle to revision and criticism. It may have unintended consequences, it may have morally unacceptable consequences. And that's what we're going through at the moment in this society, I believe, about the nature of wealth and ownership and so on. That the big theories, be it fairness, everybody earns the same, seem to be out of fashion at the moment. But the other, you just let the whole business ethic run, and big business will sort out what your values are. I don't think neither is adequate, and that's where the discussion, partly on empirical grounds, of what happens if this is what you do, and unintended consequences. I'll give you another example that has more to do with legislation, because I've been arguing about this in the House of Lords. If you're a Scot who lives in Scotland, you will not pay tuition fees at university. If you're English and you want to go to a Scottish university, you'll cough up no more than you would in England, but there'll be two next to each other. And what's worse, apparently, there will be people from Dublin, Denmark, Athens and Bonn who are paying no fees either. Now, this is a bizarre outcome of much well-meaning legislation. And it's not what anybody would have wished or written down as the goal of devolution and devolving funding councils and so on and so forth. And I think a Humean approach, which I'm trying to take, of course, a Humean approach is say, well, look, stand back and say, how do we get here? And does it have to be like this, or is there a better way of organising things? And that applies much more importantly to concepts like justice and property. How did we get to the position where is it 0.1% of the population owns X tens of percents of everything? And actually the gap between those on lower incomes and those on higher incomes has increased rather than moderated in some way. That's the point where Hume says this is essential to the sustainability of the society we live in, that we get this straight, or that we get it better. Now the difference is that there are a number of, and often politicians, political ideologues, who think there is one answer. And I see this week by week on education. People think there's one answer about how to do it. The kids are not like that. But that's the view that often is taken. And if you drive, and this is what Hume was most against, sorry I'm going on, but this illustrates the point very well. What Hume was most against was having a separately structured theory that drove every practical decision without any question or sceptical comeback. And so that's why I think the question you're asking is very important. The nature of, I mean, in South Africa they had a system of justice, but we know how awful that was, but that's what they would have said at the time. No, this is according to the law. And the law is created by those who are voted in. We've been voted in, and that's the law. I mean, you need the skeptic asking you questions.
My point was more about the comment that was made before. But it seems to me that what further complicates our understanding of Hume's account of the evolution of justice is his concept of equity, which is called a natural virtue.
Yes.
And so what relation is there between the natural virtue of equity and the artificial virtue of justice? Does one help explain the other? Because it seems to me, especially in the treatise, that relation goes underexplained, and of course Annette Bayer has said a lot about this. But it still seems unclear to me that equity plays any real role in understanding this artificial conception of justice. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that. Because it seems to me that in a familial setting, we have a concept of equity and fairness which is natural to us, but that isn't the same kind of thing as justice in the much broader sense that Hume talks about.
Yeah, I mean, even I didn't say much about equity because I'm not sure what I want to say about it. So you've hit a soft spot there, and good for you. Equity within the family, however, isn't a once-for-all set. You give a two-line definition of it, because, and this goes back to the education question: is the equity to give each child the same? 2 sweets, 2 sweets, 2 sweets. 7 piano lessons, 7 piano lessons, 7 piano lessons? Or is perhaps there a more subtle concept which has to do with actually you're never going to be a great pianist and you hate going. We'll take up the cello, or you go to gymnastic classes because actually you're very, very well articulated physically. And that's where the subtlety begins to come in, which is why I find the notion of just straight equity as a natural virtue less than helpful. I don't think you could use it to define the artificial. And I think it's in the same boat, to be honest, because it's when you begin to fill out the concept of what equity means in a string of related examples of different, that you begin to see the need for greater subtlety and probably modification.
Mike?
I have a question about, towards the end you were discussing the enculturation of children into just society. And you were suggesting that kind of they learn of justice within the family, and 2, that this comes about from going through the terrible twos and then sympathy kicking in. And so you weren't fully explicit about this, but you seem to be suggesting that without sympathy, we could imagine human beings as somehow incredibly selfish or egotistical, so that it's sympathy which stops us being egotistical, and this allows us to have a more society. And I guess I didn't quite see how that worked, at least in the treatise account of justice. So I agree with you, undoubtedly sympathy plays a central role in the account of justice.
Yes.
The role that officially it plays is explaining why moral approbation is attached to justice, given that it's a natural obligation, self-interest. So, kind of 2 worries about the story that you told. The first is that, as far as I recall, there isn't any discussion of sympathy developmentally in the treatise. So there's no hypothesis about when we get sympathy or when we don't. It's just part of our natural makeup that we have sympathy. So it's not clear that it would come later too. But the other thing is that in general, as Hume would consider that incredibly selfish people would have to have sympathy. Many of the things, if they have interest in any social goods, they would have to have sympathy in order to have any awareness, in order to be moved in the appropriate way through their awareness of others' feelings. So it's not clear that the mechanism of sympathy is there somehow to constrain selfishness. And moreover, in the discussion of justice itself, I take it that Hume's actually kind of explicit that the opposition there is not between the selfish egotist and the altruistic moral person. The contrast is rather between the partial, whose interests may well go beyond themselves. For start, they may be interested in their friends and their family, indeed, or they may hate their family, that's one of his worries, and so punish family members more than would be just. So the contrast is between partiality and impartiality. And what's distinctive of justice, which doesn't come just with the natural virtues, is impartiality. And at that point, selfishness is brought to play in explaining impartiality, because, as I said before, the natural obligation of justice is self-interest. And clearly, you know, he's teasing his more moralistic readers. I mean, it's theoretically serious, but also he takes pleasure in pointing out that it's self-interest that is the basis of being moral, which is inverting a common.
Yes.
Christian stories. So that seemed to be a bit in tension with the. I mean, I know that's more phylogenetic than the ontogenetic story that you were telling, that somehow we get people to stop being selfish and be jealous.
Well, there's a lot in that, very helpfully put, thank you very much. Just to start with sympathy, there are various different, I mean, we're bogged down because of the way we use the term today, which really is not in the way in which Hume and Adam Smith were using it. But if you try and then look back to, well, impose some grid on it to see if you can make more sense of it, you could try to see sympathy as purely a mechanism. And that's what I'm inclined to see it as, because the point you make, and it doesn't square with the use of sympathy today, which is generally thought to be a good thing. But actually, insight into the motives, feelings, and thoughts of others is part of being very successful as a ruthless businessman. And that involves some of the same, presumably, techniques and learning processes and so on. And if you see sympathy simply as a mechanism, it's like education. It can do the job well, or it can do the job badly, or actually be misappropriated for other purposes. Rather than there being, I don't think sympathy is not, I don't believe is a virtue. It's a mechanism. And if he said otherwise, then I beg leave to disagree with him. The role then, so the later part of what you said, how much of this is there in Hume? He's just not explicit. He wasn't asking questions in the way we do, and the language was used in a different way. But don't forget, he was a pragmatist, and that therefore the mechanism of sympathy could be modified as you go along. And it might be that this mechanism could be developed well within the family or within another context. And if that was so, that's fine by Hume. But the importance of self-interest, I think, again, it was the wicked pen, and he was enjoying this. And Adam Smith made something of this as well, with whom he corresponded quite a lot about sympathy. Because within the notion of sympathy and within the notion of justice, there is a self-interest. You want society to function. And that's a major self-interest. And the basis for the pragmatic questions Hume would reasonably put to people, well, fine, that's your theory, but you do realize this will be the outcome. And self-interest, which is intertwined with the process of having that, understanding that, is really quite fundamental. But I don't know if there's more you wanted to put into the point of self-interest there.
No, it's just the contrast of the role of self-interest is that the contrast that we're getting in the discussion of justice is not between immoral or amoral man who's selfish,
that's right,
and the moral man who is sometimes somehow altruistic. That's not the contrast.
No.
So the function of sympathy presumably can't be that which stops us being selfish. No, selfish people, as you just pointed out, presumably have the mechanism of sympathy. So whatever is involved in our moral education within the family, sympathy isn't presumably playing the key role. And the role that self-interest plays in explaining justice isn't peculiarly located in the family. That's through the genealogy of
the one word I disagree with you over there is the word key. When you say sympathy is not the key, it doesn't have the key role, it has a role, but there are several other things. And so, for example, point I made that someone who wants to use many of the skills involved in sympathy to work out what his opponent's going to do in the next deal, that is using sympathy for quite another purpose. It's not either a virtue or not a virtue, and therefore it does not have to do with distinguishing between the naturally selfish and the naturally virtuous. And I do think Hume had a fairly low opinion of us, if you use the word naturally. which is why all these mechanisms were so important in pulling us into a society that was civil. But I think you're absolutely right. Justice is not simply a distinction between the naturally nice people and the unpleasant, which is not recognised in the society in which we live. Sometimes a bit of a shibboleth is made about, I could tempt you again, but I won't, about natural rights. I mean, I think the language all around all of that is just so uncertain and confused for the same reasons that Hume would reasonably want to ask sceptical questions, where do they come from? But he'd also want to ask practical questions. Classic examples today. If all of these are natural rights, and in the end they're not compatible, what do you do about it? And there is an issue of pragmatism there, looking at the structure that you have.
Sure.
I really enjoyed the way that, although I missed a bit of your talk, for which apologies, I enjoyed the way that you tried to imagine maybe Hume's, how he might have perceived language today. Although at one point I misheard you when you introduced it. I almost misheard you as attributing thoughts about Twitter to Hume, but then you went on to the tabloid press, and I knew that couldn't be the case. But I wonder whether you haven't been a bit hard on the purported subtleties or lack of subtlety within language today, because I think you were denigrating it a bit, the contemporary language. And just as a matter of linguistic field science, if you will, I mean, there's a few counterexamples, if I may. I mean, first off, you can see how the discipline of the character limit on Twitter could have been, I mean, Hume might have enjoyed that. I mean, "'tis not contrary to reason" probably would have fitted into a tweet. And moreover, if you look at, part of the worry might be that with the proliferation of social media, for example, people are communicating more than they ever have been. And that isn't to say that a lot of the high literary content isn't still going on elsewhere, but people are communicating more than they have been, and studies show that the younger generation, for example, are better at spelling than they used to be. And that might be counterintuitive, but actually you can see how that might come about, because in texting, for example, you're required maybe to be a bit more creative and phonetic in your spelling. This doesn't actually mean that you don't know how it's actually spelled. The contrary may be the case. You know, you use numbers sometimes to express words. So with that creativity, I think, comes versatility, and actually probably more subtlety is actually potentially going on than perhaps you're assuming. Also, you get the problem of maybe anonymity on blogs. You know, people, trolls, for example, submitting very offensive remarks because under cover of anonymity. That happens. So you've got another related problem of a lack of editorial control. But with that, actually, you get people speaking more directly, and maybe more unconscious thoughts becoming present in a way they weren't. So all in all, you've got a greater range of thoughts being expressed, some very crudely and bluntly, but also a greater sophistication. And I'm sure the crudity was going on even in Hume's time, so I don't think there's a worry there. I mean, you make the additional, more substantive point about the language of rights. There's a problem there of fittedness and robustness of the actual concept notion of rights. But maybe, again, the wider problem is maybe even multiculturalism, and different campaigning groups maybe lobbying in the most effective way for their claims, and using that language, exploiting it in a way they shouldn't. But again, we still require language to be able to tease out the differences. I mean, all of that is true. We need a discussion, see? That's precisely what I hope the Enlightenment folks would have wanted. An argument and counter-argument of precisely this kind. Language today is used in incredibly sophisticated ways by scientists, by computer specialists, by people who work in the structure of the human body, DNA, stem cells. The language is incredibly sophisticated in those areas and in others. And what I'm suggesting, maybe that's not paralleled by the kind of discussion we have of moral and social ethical issues. And it's I wouldn't say it's a problem in society, because it does marvellous things for us. It keeps us alive longer than we would have been. But the sophistication is there. I don't disagree with that at all. But it's a very different type of sophistication from the language of the belles-lettres and Hume himself. But I think there are sufficient analogies to see the importance of that. But
as in Hume's time, and that's why he didn't get any of the jobs he wanted in universities, the unsophisticated use of language was very strong. The man's an atheist, we can't have him in here. And no subtlety at all. So you're right, it was around in Hume's time. I suppose I was having a sideways plan. Trouble with Twitter for me is my thumbs and fingers are too big and don't move fast enough. But that's purely a matter of age and physical structure, and doubtless is one of my biases. But I do agree, there is the amount of communication. I'm not as convinced yet that there is something being communicated distinct from fairly primitive grunts and groans, but that's another matter. And you read some of these tweets when they're reported. Goodness me. What the wife of a Prime Minister thought it important to tweet out to half the world. Not just a friend, to half the world. Something strange about that. But I agree. There is.
We can agree that Hume might have done quite well on Twitter then. Because
Yeah,
some of these turns of phrase are aphoristic, aren't
yeah,
they?
oh, I mean, he could produce the headline piece, and he did. No doubt about that.
This may be imposing a sort of different conceptual scheme on Hume, but did he have a concept of that society had emergent properties, that that it was susceptible of, say, rational critique on those? This is a line which divides, say, Hume from Hegel, maybe, or from a lot of other later social workers. And what's his ontology of society in the large? And
I have no doubt, and this was the basis of his pragmatism and the point about monarchy and republicanism. It depends how it has evolved and developed. And if it has evolved and developed in this way rather than that, maybe that's the best option we've got, at least for the time being. And so the critique that he would invoke and indeed encourage would be one that was partly pragmatic in nature. I mean, I don't know whether he would justify the practice of religion by his friends as well. It makes them happy, which by and large it does. But the critique is to draw the line precisely there. You may not use that to expand into providing moral instruction. So yes, and that's, again, the difference between being an empiricist and a non-empiricist. He wanted the evidence of society rather than a structured theory, whether it's dialectical materialism or what. He wanted the evidence of what's happened to be the basis for critique and evolution by implication. So I couldn't pull out a text that implied that the development or evolution of society was first in his mind, but by implication.
Yeah, I just pick up something that Mike was introducing. It seems to me that there are two. I mean, sympathy, of course, has far more exposure in the treatise than in the second inquiry. But in both of them, I think there are two capacities of the mind which may or may not have very much to do with sympathy. One, of course, is the ability to subsume short-term interest under long-term interest. That's very important to the development of contract, justice, promises, and so on. Another one is the ability to take up the common point of view, or the general point of view. So certainly in the second inquiry, the sort of fact almost, the basic fact of our moral natures is going to be that, if you tell me about Brutus doing something honourable, I praise him, that's good, good old Brutus, I say. It's not going to affect me. It's nothing to do with my interest, but I feel approval of Brutus having behaved well or badly. I can't remember which he did. But I can take up the common point of view, the general point of view. It seems to be the point of view of those who are immediately affected by the kind of thing Brutus used to do and who are on his side. It seems to me that those are the mechanisms which eventually are responsible for justice, because self-interest is continually at the bottom of it, but it's a very enlarged self-interest which sees ourselves as behaving in ways which will eventually produce the common good. So it was just a riff really on what Mike said.
Certainly that's how it was developed in Adam Smith, but you're right about the inquiry being a bit light on this. I mean, book 2 of the treatise virtually disappeared.
Yes.
And indeed, generations of philosophers paid little attention to it. I think it was Pal Ardal who wrote his Passion and Virtue in Hume's treatise, and he picked up the book 2 and said, look, there's something, Hume thought this was important, and he thought it was too, which is understanding some of the mechanisms. And spent a lot of time on pride and humility. So, can you feel pride in absolutely anything? Well, some do, but you know, I'm proud of Ben Nevis, highest mountain in the United Kingdom. Well, it's a bit sort of on the edge, isn't it? Not for some, but would be for. Are there any rules and constraints about emotions and the appropriateness and the objects of emotion? I mean, Anthony Kenny wrote about this, but he didn't get Hume right, mind you. But sorry, that's just a shot from the wings. The very important place of the treatise that the treatise gives to the emotions and passions in part 2 is, and he must have decided that basically people weren't picking it up, weren't following it, weren't understanding it, because the inquiry was an attempt to make his philosophy more understandable. I think it's very much at the core of empirically what he wanted to do. Because in the end, all these judgments had to be constrained by what we saw as the fact. So I'm not sure about Brutus and the common perception, because presumably Mark Antony didn't share that. And you know, there were two sides. There wasn't a common view. There were those who thought Caesar was a dreadful tyrant. I'm reading the Shakespearean version of this actually. Who thought he was a terrible tyrant, had to be got rid of. And there were those for whom he was a friend, and a nobleman, and so on. So I'm not sure. Well, that wouldn't be a good example of what was commonly shared that simply gets you in touch with. And I'm a bit leery about there being something commonly shared. I mean, I think there was an artificiality here that had to be done.
Well, the capacity. Sorry. No, there's a cue.
Okay, just one last quick question.
I'm sorry, it might be not too quick, but what exactly is the connection between the refinement of language and moral development? Because apparently you suggested in your answer to the other question that not every kind of sophistication is the right kind of sophistication in language to increase moral development on the distinguishability of moral concepts.
Well, I think it's another example of the same that we keep bumping into. Sophistication in the use of language and the development of it is the development of a mechanism. People can use language in very sophisticated ways to be immensely cruel. So it's not inevitably that the outcome will be what we naturally respond to as morally admirable. But I suppose the point I'm making beyond that, and Hume, interestingly, and Peter Jones has written about this, Hume traces it through aesthetics. And having a language sufficiently sophisticated to begin to deal in aesthetic concepts is actually a sign that a society is becoming civilized. And maintaining it. And I think the same applies in morality. I mean, these questions about justice, about human rights, they require a degree of subtlety that language has to underwrite.
Right, but then you mean something else by subtlety, and not just the increase in vocabulary of some sort or other. Because, I mean, we could take the increase in names for bacteria species or something like that as a kind of a quantitative sophistication of language, which is obviously not sufficient to produce some kind of different engagement with others, is it?
No, it's not a sufficient condition
right.
of moral insight, if you want to put it in those terms. Not a sufficient condition, but as with others, it's one of the mechanisms which, if absent, and there is no capacity to begin to moderate how you think about your emotions and so on, then you've at least got one moral hand tied behind your back. What a dreadful metaphor, but you perhaps see what I mean.
I didn't get the metaphor, sorry. Can you just repeat it?
Well, no, I couldn't possibly repeat
I'll ask you later. Thank you.
But it's if there are these, education does this all the time. It gives, through the process of education, an increase in capacity to do things, but it does not determine the values that those being educated inevitably have, because they can use these capacities in other ways, and that applies to the use of language.
Thank you.
We should stop there just before we thank Stewart. Just to say, own arrangements for lunch if you're not local. I think there's a cafeteria on the ground floor of Senate House. There's a cafe in Russell Square. There's one in the British Museum. There are lots knocking around. Shara was gesticulating at me. I think he may have been wanting me to draw your attention to the OUP book stand, which is over there. And we'll reconvene at 1:30. But I'd just like to thank Stewart again for a very enlightening talk.